Thanks very much, Nikki, and thank you so much to everybody for coming out tonight and doing me the privilege of presenting to you, and I hope this is a good riveting talk and you get a lot out of it. Firstly, I think before I wanted to begin, I guess I wanted to challenge you up front in your thinking, and that I think we really need to acknowledge that by and large, all of us here are very privileged in our life in Australia, in the things that we have access to. We are a very privileged country, but our privileges are really based on, generally speaking, an extractive business model, and that is at the cost of many and at the benefit of others. And I think really that is really impacting our ecosystems, and it really needs to challenge our way of thinking about our systems and ensuring that we really, basically in very plain English, do good on the ground and measure good outcomes and ensure that what we're saying in the nature repair space is backed up with really solid, robust, scientifically evidenced claims. So it's just a bit of a taste of where I'm hoping to take this lecture. And just a little bit about me. So my background is I was formerly trained as a marine ecologist at UQ, received a PhD from there. And then from there I worked Queensland Government, Great Barrier Reef, reef policy, water quality management systems. I was fortunate enough to manage the marine parks of the Pilbara for about 7 years, which I have accustomed to basically loving Western Australia, so I always loved the opportunity to come back. And then I moved back to Queensland and I worked in maritime operations, and then I worked in aquaculture sustainability markets, and then I worked in an economics firm for about 4 years before joining Accounting for Nature a couple of years ago. And what's really interesting from a career perspective is when I was doing my PhD, I was fortunate enough to be a scholar with the Wentworth Group of Concerned Scientists in 2008. And it was in 2008 that the Accounting for Nature model, which I will be talking about in the second half of my talk, was developed by that group of scientists and economists. So it's quite kind of fateful that 15, 16 years later, I'm actually working and leading a big part of Accounting for Nature. So thank you very much for having me. So just continuing on with that idea of privilege, if you look at the Human Development Index, Australia is ranked number 10 out of 193 countries. And that really looks at access to, healthcare, our GDP, access to education. But what it doesn't really look at is how we interact with our ecosystems and how we, function within planetary boundaries. And there was a study that came out a couple of years ago that looked at, well, what if you did just simply include our footprint and our carbon emissions? Where would Australia rank from a Human Development Index? And we basically plummet from 10 to 106. So it's just a bit of reflection that I wanted to start the talk with, and just challenge you all to be quite comfortable where we sit. So why are planetary boundaries important? And I just want to acknowledge the great work of Kate Raworth from Donut Economics. It was probably the first bit of economics that I ever read when I first went into economics, so I admit I started late in the economics field, but it really challenges a lot of systems thinking around how we do economics. What do we measure as progress in growth? And from year to year, a lot of developed countries really focus on how do we measure growth, and largely that is GDP. But what if we measured our growth and progress in other ways? And so what the donut economics theory really presents is that we have basically an inner circle, which is the bare minimum for access that humans need, really. So access to drinking water, access to hygiene, education, networks, energy, water, all those things. And then the outer boundary is basically the realm in which we can live and sustain ourselves on the planet, because we don't have another one. So if we had the outer and the inner circle and we measured our progress and performance from an economic perspective as within those bounds, what would it look like? And there's some of the things that are really challenging our thinking around economics, and quite a challenging space for us to be in at the moment. Essentially overstepping these boundaries, we start to push on things like ecosystem collapse. And that diagram in the top right basically is that donut, but it showcases the areas where we have already passed that ceiling. So the ecological ceiling in many senses, from land conservation to biodiversity loss climate change, and many aspects of pollution. A lot of areas that are grey is because we don't really have consensus on the indicators. But that's a really important thing to acknowledge. We're living and way outside our boundaries at the moment, so something needs to change. We're pushing, it's demonstrated through rising extinction rates. We are in our 6th extinction crisis. Something has to change, something needs to be done. So the challenge is we must become nature positive in the next decade. We're already seeing ecosystem collapse across a lot of ecosystems. A lot of phase shifts already taking place. I think Malcolm McCulloch's talk a couple of weeks ago, he talked about how we're already over the 2% degree warming. But to do that, we need a mass injection of finance into ecosystem or nature restoration. We need $44 trillion US dollars, which is over 50% of our global GDP. Sorry, let me rephrase that. $44 trillion US dollars, over 50% of our global GDP is highly, moderately linked to nature. So that's reflecting that ecosystems provide services to us that we need to survive. They're part of business, they're part of products that we generate. We are intrinsically linked to nature. Climate, extreme weather and biodiversity loss have been highlighted by the WEF as the top 3 risks to the globe. So net zero and nature positive, we're at a juncture where we just cannot wait any longer. We really need to invest in becoming nature positive, and I'll break down what that means. So from a global policy perspective, there's a lot of things that have happened in the last decade that's really driving a lot of this change at a global policy level, and we're starting to see that then filter down into jurisdictions, into local policy. So the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, or commonly known as the GBF, is probably one of the most significant frameworks that has been developed recently. And that targets, or one of the targets, is a 30% conservation of the globe by 2030, sorry. Got too far ahead, that would not be good, it is way too far down the line. The UN High Seas Treaty, that establishes the legislative frameworks for conserving biodiversity in areas in the ocean which is beyond jurisdiction, so in that international area, and that fits quite nicely with the GBF. The Paris Agreement, 2015, it's quite old now, but it was very focused on climate, on emissions, and its target was 2 degrees and ideally 1.5 degrees. But we're already surpassing that. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, really focus on sustainability targets, so they look at social, economic and environmental targets. So a lot of those goals also start to translate into these other frameworks that have been developed. And then Biodiversity Finance Initiative, also known as BioFin, that is another initiative that's focused on mobilising finance into biodiversity projects and really seeing on-ground objectives delivered. And then we've got what's called the GRI, which is the Global Reporting Initiative, which sets up standards for reporting at that ESG level, so that environmental, sustainable, social governance level. So all these things combined are really starting to drive the momentum into restoring nature, setting those upper level frameworks, establishing those targets and goals, to essentially say that globally, this needs to happen. These are the agreed targets. Go forth and try and meet them in some way. So the rise of the nature positive movements really come out of the Global Biodiversity Framework. And the Nature Positive Initiative is basically the next step in that framework. What's interesting though are definitions around nature positive. And this is something that's getting a lot of attention lately, because if we can't agree on the definition of nature positive, how do we measure it and report on it? So this is just some of the definitions. So the first one, which is the most specific one, comes from that Nature Positive Initiative that comes out of the GBF, and that's to halt and reverse nature loss by 2030 on a 2020 baseline. So it sets a baseline. This is where it is that we need to show positive, net positive outcomes, and that's by 2050. So it's very clear in setting goals, targets, baselines. The next one is from the World Economic Forum. Nature positive means enhancing the resilience of our planet and societies to halt and reverse nature loss. A little bit looser. And then the last one's from the Council of Sustainable Business. A nature positive approach puts nature and biodiversity gain at the heart of decision making and design. It feels nice, but it doesn't tell you, it doesn't set a goal specifically, which makes it very hard then, if that was your definition, to be able to produce, I guess, a claim or demonstrate your outcomes or achievement of nature positive. If we are going to deliver on nature positive objectives, we need to have a definition that is specific. One of the core elements of nature positive, and this has come up time and time again, particularly in the last 2 years, and really pushed by the academic community, is the mitigation hierarchy. So the mitigation hierarchy sets the guidelines for how do you actually demonstrate a net positive benefit. And so the first step in the mitigation hierarchy is avoidance, so avoiding the impact on nature in the beginning. If you can't avoid it, I can't even look at my slides, they're so small. Minimise, look up at the screen. Minimise what you can't avoid. What you've avoided, and you minimise, restore what is then still noted as an impact. And then, and this is a tricky area, offsets, and maybe we'll talk about offsets a little bit more in the panel. But all these things need to be done first before you can reach a net positive outcome. And then you need to contribute further to the restoration of nature to be able to say net positive. And that's just at a theoretical level. We haven't even spoken about how do you measure nature, what components do you measure to be able to do that. So at the same time as the Nature Positive Initiative, and actually what happened before the Nature Positive Initiative was a thing called the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. Big mouthful. Very simply, it was a task force that was set up that acknowledged that large businesses and corporations need to measure and identify the risks along the supply chain where they interact with nature. So I had before that over 50% of businesses interact with nature. Where do they interact with nature and what are the risks and impacts? And then to measure it and then to disclose it. So the TNFD has been operating for a couple of years now and gone through piloting, looking at supply chains along large corporations, about where identifying those areas, measuring those areas, and how to disclose their impacts along those areas of their supply chain. So you've got these two things that kind of have been working side by side over the last year, and they're really starting to pull together into one mega objective, which is nature positive. And it's now becoming almost a bit of a flavour across not only corporations but governments as they address how they're going to meet these goals and targets that have been set under the GBF. Corporations are doing it because there's a growing expectation by the community consumers and even their employees within their organisations that they need to be able to highlight where they're touching on nature, where they're impacting on nature, where nature is degrading because of their operations, and also what they're doing then to improve the state of nature. There's also opportunities as well. It's not just all about risk. There's opportunities for government entities, corporations to invest in the restoration of nature. And there's a huge appetite now, not only for individual companies, but on the share market, companies that manage large asset portfolios. There's a huge drive, particularly coming from the European Union around this. I mean, the Australian borders are not closed. We export a lot to the European Union. We export to a lot of countries that are setting very high, I guess, sustainability targets, and Australia is starting to understand how that's going to impact us. And lastly, and I'll get into this in a little bit, is around the pressure to make claims and what needs to underpin claims. How do they evidence their claims that they're making? And that's where we'll get into greenwashing. So we need to urgently finance nature. There's a lot of numbers that are flying around about how much we need to invest in nature. One of the most common kind of gaps, which is a really large gap when you think about it, is that we need an additional $600 billion US dollars to $820 US billion dollars per year to essentially reach those nature positive goals. There's a significant amount of finance that we need to get mobilising. So there's a couple of things that are driving that market growth. There's, as I said before, there's the driver from the sustainability side of things. So ESG reporting a couple of years ago, probably didn't hear that much of it. Now it's in every conversation or not in every conversation, but it's in every boardroom. It's part of annual reports. How do we measure and report, disclose our impacts from an environmental perspective? What are we doing in that space? Sustainability from a carbon emissions perspective, and our governance arrangements. The carbon market is also being a major mobiliser in this space as well. So looking at how we can leverage the existing carbon market, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. And then also in Australia, we've got the Nature Repair Act, the Nature Repair Bill, and the development of the voluntary nature repair market. So I guess it's well accepted that leveraging the carbon market is going to be one of the major factors that's driving money going into nature repair collectively, not just through the nature repair market, but through private voluntary markets as well. So when carbon projects are established, say for example on a property, they're doing mass plantings of improving habitat. And generally speaking, there are improvements to the environment, improvements to habitat, improvements to ecosystems, and these are all things that are called environmental co-benefits. And environmental co-benefits are attracting a premium on the carbon market if you can evidence and show and demonstrate that there is uplift in the environment resulting from that carbon project. So there's a lot of commitment to, and a lot of mandated commitment to net zero transition. And so that is being seen as a major mover in financing nature repair and biodiversity uplift. And just in that graph there, you can see that just over the years, there is a huge demand for carbon units and expected to basically just keep going up that trend. So yeah, we expect to see that and then potentially see a shift over towards nature credits in the future. So the interest in nature credits is growing really rapidly. It is something that over the last 2 years, 2 years ago was only maybe mumbled about. It's in a lot of pretty much every conversation now around nature repair. Biodiversity credits are very different to carbon credits. Carbon credits represent carbon emission avoided, sequestered. Biodiversity credits are quite unique. They can represent lots of different things. They could represent a singular environmental asset, like a native vegetation, or a singular species, or they could represent an ecosystem. That in itself is quite a challenging thing to get your head around. Biodiversity credits, like carbon credits, need to be verifiable, they need to be quantifiable, and they need to be tradable. And they essentially are a financial instrument. And the idea is that through purchasing, buying and selling biodiversity credits, you can really drive uplift in biodiversity through market mechanisms, essentially. Already there's over 30 different biodiversity credit schemes in the world. A lot of them are going through a piloting phase, and not all biodiversity credits are created equal. Not only do they represent different things, like one could be a species, one could represent an ecosystem, but the way in which they're calculated, what they represent from a calculation point of view, they're all quite different. The different requirements for how do you measure and report on biodiversity credit are very different across all the standards. So this is something that is gaining a lot of attention globally around what are the key attributes of a biodiversity credit. How do we set a standard? What kind of standards do we need to ensure like a minimum quality of biodiversity credits? This type of, these discussions are happening at the World Economic Forum. There's a group called the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, which is established with the WEF to basically work out what these key attributes need to be to support a high integrity biodiversity credit market to ensure that the outcomes that are being claimed and reported on the ground are real, but they're also sustained. Which leads me to integrity. Integrity is becoming the #1 principle of biodiversity credits, and this is off the back of a lot of lessons that we've learned from the voluntary carbon market. So ensuring that what is claimed is accurate and true, and what can be evidenced and is transparent. So if you read about a biodiversity credit that's sold from one entity to another and you want to find out information about it, there needs to be the evidence to support that. You need to understand what that represents, how it was measured, what the attributes are of that credit. There's a lot of distrust, generally speaking, in that market space around nature credits and carbon credits, and it's an area that's been highlighted as basically one of the #1 issues that needs to be dealt with. In saying that as well, in Australia, particularly around the notion of greenwashing, the ACCC has highlighted that they're really cracking down on claims or greenwashing claims. So a greenwashing claim is a claim that is made to deceive, essentially, where there's not sufficient evidence to back up that that claim is accurate. And I'll give you some examples. So essentially the trust gap is growing, and this was a report that was put out by PwC. And I like this quote, that customers buy it, employees feel it, and investors demand it. Seems to be the attitude, generally speaking, across the board. I know myself, when I receive products now and they say sustainable, and it's just a sticker, I think you just bought that off eBay. Like, where's the evidence for it? I go on their website, I can't find the evidence for it. Everyone's very tuned in to greenwashing these days. There's just so much distrust. And what I thought was really interesting in this is a very big report, and it's got a lot of interesting stats actually. But that within a company, from looking at environmental impact and climate-related climate-related risks, that employees and consumers are the most, think it's the most important, whereas the business executives don't think that reporting on environmental risks is that important. I just thought that was very interesting. So essentially, the lack of good quality data, the lack of good quality standards make it really difficult for consumers, who are market participants, and other participants in the market to basically verify that what is being said is true and accurate. And this is becoming really important in the nature restoration space. If we are going to truly achieve these goals to become nature positive, we need to ensure that claims and the evidence behind them is rigorous. There's so many risks associated with lack of integrity and lack of trust. And one of the things I keep thinking of is when you step in bubble gum, you can rip off 90% of the bubble gum, but you've always got a little bit still stuck on there. And there's a lot of fear now amongst our corporations and our businesses around bad reputation in this space. It is just, it's a huge trend we've really seen change over the last 5 to 10 years, particularly in the last year around these crisis talks and nature positive strategy approaches. This is a really good study, and I put this up at Biodiversity conference last year. So this came out of the UK last year, and it reported on ecosystem restoration by 100 of the world's largest businesses by revenue. Basically, it breaks down, there we go. So 100 businesses across 10 sectors, so each line is a sector. 66 businesses said that they carry out ecosystem restoration, and out of those 100 businesses, 40 businesses reported area covered or number of trees planted, 12 reported budget that was invested in restoration costs, 34 businesses mentioned ecological monitoring activities, and only 4 businesses report ecological monitoring outcomes. So 4 out of 100 businesses in a study that was done last year actually reported ecological monitoring outcomes from projects that they said and reported they invested in restoration of nature. So this brings me to Accounting for Nature, and I'm going to talk for the next 15 minutes about who we are, why we exist, and what we're doing in this space to help bring integrity to claims around ecosystem restoration and management. So one of the ways that we can deal with or ensuring integrity of claims is by having an environmental accounting standard. So environmental accounting is a way, like financial accounting, it's a way for measuring and reporting in a standardised way the condition of the environment. And what that does, like we do with financial accounting, is it brings transparency to those reports, to those claims. It brings independence. So a lot of financial accounts most financial accounts have to be independently audited to ensure that the information in there is accurate. They can be compared through a standardised measure, which in Accounting for Nature we call it the econ, and I'll talk about that in a sec. They need to be usable and practical They need to be able to be implemented across scales. One of the challenges that we have in measuring the condition of the environment and therefore reporting change and then managing the environment is that we don't have a standardised way of doing it, and it makes it very difficult to be able to educate markets on something that is very complex, of like our ecosystems, if we don't have a way of reporting ecosystem condition or change in a way that makes sense to them, but not at the sacrifice of good quality science. One of the key things about accounting for nature is that we don't sacrifice the science, and I'll go into that in a second. So environmental accounting has been around for a long time, So it was first proposed in the 1970s. The UNCEO was drafted in 1993, which is a global framework that provides, it's a framework for measuring the condition of the ecosystem, but also a way for then attributing value to the ecosystem services. What gets quite confusing, and we found people do get quite confused around definitions, we have environmental condition accounting, which is what accounting for nature does, and there's natural capital accounting. So natural capital accounting, which is what UNCEO essentially is, quantifies and values the stocks of the environment and the flows of natural resources and ecosystem services in more economic terms. What we do at Accounting for Nature is environmental condition accounting. So we just focus on the condition or the state of nature. So we ensure that we use rigorous science to then report on just the condition of nature, which can then be used to underpin other environmental natural capital accounting pathways. So Accounting for Nature was established essentially as a model about 15 years ago by the Wentworth Group. It was created because they saw a need for a standardisation of how you measure and report on the condition of nature so that it can be used to help with making decisions at that economic level by producing what we call a common currency. And what we do at Accounting for Nature, we are a standard. So we administer the standard that anybody can essentially use to support public claims around the condition or the state of nature. We accredit scientific methods that then underpin the development of environmental accounts. We provide scientific advisory services to people who need help in developing environmental accounts. We build a community of practice through accrediting experts that can help people develop environmental accounts. And we're also heavily investing in technology to help make environmental account development more cost efficient. As technology grows and our ability to use technology to measure the state of nature gets better, that's how it's really important for us to try and start integrating that in to our standard and our methods, but not at the sacrifice of good quality rigorous science. So Accounting for Nature, there's so many global frameworks out there. Why do we need another standard? Why do we need another framework? The challenge with a lot of the frameworks that are out there is that they highlight the importance of measuring the condition of the environment, but they don't tell you how to do it. Because there's, at a global scale, it's very hard to set a set of metrics for a specific environmental asset, and then set that up at a global level, whereas Accounting for Nature, through the development and accreditation of methods that are specific to a region, specific to a scale, can underpin the development of accounts. And then the accounts can then be used to underpin reporting to these other global frameworks. So an environmental account developed by under Accounting for Nature standard can be used to underpin progress towards goals, like SDG goals, GBF goals, or they can be used to underpin ESG reporting. What's really unique about Accounting for Nature framework is we have what we call the econ metric, and the econ enables accounts to be compared across scales and across regions. So the econ index, as the name suggests, is an index from 0 to 100. It's a composite index where 0 represents highly degraded state of nature, 100 represents the reference benchmark of nature. It's quite unique in that a lot of the other standards that are out there don't use reference benchmarking, which means that it can't be compared over time. By nature of using it can't be compared over time and in spatial scale. What we find is that by using that reference benchmark, and just the very nature of having a reference benchmark through a composite index, is you can compare an account. So you can develop an account in Western Australia using a native vegetation method, and you can compare it to an account developed in Queensland using a native vegetation method, because they use local site-specific reference benchmarks. What we're seeing is a lot of standards that are being developed use project-based starting points as a reference benchmark, which is good, that's fine, but it doesn't mean you can compare that project to another project in another area. So when you start to think about then, how do you use that information in a market when credits are generated, it can become quite complicated if you can't compare one credit to another credit because they don't use the same referencing solution. The other thing I'll just talk about here is the methods that are developed under AFN are given an accuracy level. So we don't accredit a method that uses anything or employs anything lower than an 80% accuracy level. Why this is important is because the accuracy level tells you how rigorous the method is that is used to measure that condition of that particular asset. So what we see is that for 95% methods, there's typically a lot more sample sites, there's a lot more on-ground monitoring. 80% methods, typically less. They might integrate some remote sensing, for example. What we're seeing in the nature credit market development is there's demand for methods that are supported by very high accuracy methods, which is very telling, and that's kind of information that's coming in from the market. They want high integrity credits. They want credits that are supported by high quality, rigorous science. So to develop an environmental account under the standard, it's a pretty straightforward 5-step process. Accounts are developed at a baseline year, so time 0. And then they're certified at their baseline, and then they have to go through recertification every 5 years. Part of the design step of environmental account, which is a really important step, is what we call materiality assessment. So basically that's in response to acknowledging that you can't measure everything. So if you want to develop an environmental account on a property, and you've highlighted that there's native vegetation, soil, kangaroos, koalas, you could list a wealth of species. What do you measure? Why do you measure it? What's important and why? We're agnostic as to what you measure, but we really encourage people to go through the process, working out what's important. And we also call it double materiality, because we don't just look at it through the view of what's important ecologically, but also from a business perspective, from a cultural heritage perspective. It's really important to go through that process and identify, why am I developing an account? What do I need to measure? So to build an account, it needs to be developed using an accredited method. Our methods are developed under different asset classes, and this is common language with global frameworks like the UNCR. So we've made a purposeful effort to ensure that terminology is consistent, because in this space, terminology can get very confusing and often do not align. Methods are developed under realms, so ocean, terrestrial, and crossover realms, and then by assets within those realms. And if you go onto our method catalogue on our website, you will see a number of methods that have been developed and accredited. The methods are they're not developed by accounting for nature, they're developed by independence. So we've had methods developed by university scholars, by organisations like Bush Heritage Australia. They develop a method which essentially takes what you would say would be long-term monitoring protocols, and what they're doing is they're assigning, they're calculating or developing a process for calculating that econ score, so that final index. So they're taking an existing method typically, and then attributing how do you measure an econ. And basically that goes down to each indicator within a method has its own relationship with its own reference benchmark. Okay, so then each indicator then is aggregated up. So native vegetation, for example, you might have canopy cover, shrub cover. Each of those have their own indicator scoring system that then gets aggregated up to a final number out of 100, and that's why it's called a composite index. When those methods are developed, they go through an independent science committee. We have one of our members here in the audience tonight, and they review that method, and they review it against the standard to make sure that it is representative of the accuracy level and that it does measure the condition of that asset appropriately using best science. So what does an account look like? Essentially, an environmental account is underneath what we will say is an environmental account. Could be a number of individual asset accounts. So you might have an asset account for soil, an asset account for native vegetation, an asset account for fauna. All those asset accounts underpinned by individual methods. So the method that is chosen will then deliver that asset account. But before any of that stuff is done, and this is one of the most important steps to developing an environmental account, it doesn't matter if it's an account with accounting for nature or any other standard, working out what the scope and purpose of that account is really critical, because you're measuring a baseline for an asset based on what your purpose and scope is of that environmental account. Are you developing an environmental account because you want to make claims regarding your ESG performance to an investor? Are you doing it because you've got a carbon project and you want to measure carbon co-benefits and you want to access carbon co-benefit markets? Or are you just doing it because you want to better inform your management strategies on your property? They all have different purposes and therefore different types of claims at the end, and therefore understanding that at the beginning is really a critical part of the process. So in a very, very basic sense, this is what an account looks like. It is tracking the trend of the condition of an asset over time. And the solid line represents the part that is being certified by Accounting for Nature. So they could implement a accredited method historically in the past, and that can be like a dotted line. You can show it as like an estimation. When the part that is certified becomes a solid line, and then they're allowed to set targets. And this information, the way of presenting this information needs to be quite simplistic, easy to interpret. But by then going on to a registry and then finding all the information about that account, what method was used, being able to read that method and understand what indicators were measured, understand why that account was developed, what was the proponent's purpose, and then understand if there's been any shifts or changes or disclosures that has happened in that area over time. Was there a bushfire? Was there a flood? What has happened to that account area? Providing all that information and making it publicly accessible means that any claim that they make from that account can be investigated by any of you. And that is becoming a really important and really sought after attribute in this space. Something that we've also developed is what we call a certification passport. This is basically, it goes on the registry as well. It's a flip book, it acts as a passport, and it shows every asset and the trend over time, all the indicators, all the sub-assets, and it basically becomes a clear, easy to understand communication piece. We're also working on digital verification of these communication tools. So anytime a trust mark is used for accounting for nature in public, we can track it digitally. So this type of stuff is really becoming important. The digital interface around tracking credits, tracking any claims in biodiversity management and restoration is gaining a lot of momentum, and is something that I think will become really critical. I got 5 minutes left. So what's really interesting about the Accounting for Nature framework is it is being used for so many different purposes. It's quite incredible. Once an account is certified and you have the verification of that environmental data, that is a very powerful thing to have that then you can use for lots of different purposes. So whether it's to show uplift in the condition of an asset, whether it's to show the sustainability of real assets, so forestry that a company is managing, for example, or fisheries, agriculture, or other green finance mechanisms like green bonds. Brand and marketing claims. You want to start seeing products being labelled with things saying, we're net positive, or we are not deforesting areas, or whatever. You need to be able to find the information to support those claims. Reputational risk, huge thing at the moment, and it's something that these types of accounts can really help to mitigate. And then optimising natural resource management decisions just generally, and trying to mitigate the risk on environment along your supply chain. So AFN's been running for about 4 years now. We have 56 registered environmental accounts across Australia. 22 of those have been certified, so 22 of those have gone through baseline collection and verification. It's covering over 8 million hectares of Australia. We have 96 accredited experts, so these are people that are experts in the Accounting for Nature framework and can help people build environmental accounts. We have a huge interest in the ag industry, so being able to have basically people in those areas that can help farmers develop environmental accounts, access new developing markets, access carbon co-benefit markets. There's such a huge push. They're so desperate for this kind of information and trying to understand what the opportunities are. And we've just trained so many people now in the last couple of years. So just kind of wrapping this up, I just want to take you through a couple of the key areas that Accounting for Nature is being used. So I mentioned earlier the carbon plus area. So this is carbon co-benefits. So when Accounting for Nature was established a couple of years ago, the Queensland government actually used Accounting for Nature as the independent standard to verify the carbon co-benefit claims for the LRF. So many projects we're seeing in Queensland now that are selling carbon units to the Queensland government are developing environmental accounts with Accounting for Nature as that independent verifier, which is supporting a premium payment to them. In the voluntary market, this is something that's certainly developing, although less of, but it will become a much bigger space in the future. Nature biodiversity markets, obviously this is a developing space. Accounting for Nature framework is basically an MRV framework, so a measurement, reporting, verification framework for actually showing an uplift in biodiversity. And there's a company in Australia called Green Collar, and they're actually one of the first groups to develop a crediting standard for the issuance of biodiversity credits. And to be able to do that, you actually have to develop an environmental account with Accounting for Nature, have it verified, and then you can access credits through Green Collar Nature Plus standard. We're also working quite closely with the Biodiversity Credit Alliance and the World Economic Forum on credits, what the key attributes of credits should be, what the potential issues are, what are some of the key principles of standards. So that is very much a currently developing space, and it's really good to see so much focus on integrity. Regional environmental accounting, so we go from a small property right up to the application across NRM group. So the Burnett Mary Region Group was the first large-scale, regional scale account that was developed under the framework. It covered over 5 million hectares. And what they developed that account for, it's quite a large, almost like a screening type account. And they did it to help guide their investment decisions around where they focus their restoration projects. And within that regional accounting area, they then identify smaller accounting areas, which essentially are nested within the regional account. They use different scale and different types of methods, but collectively, it really helps them to identify areas where they can get either most uplift or areas that are highly degraded that need their attention. Sustainable land management, just in basic principles. We have a number of properties that are using Accounting for Nature to help inform their decisions. A lot of groups, a lot of properties are already heavily invested in regenerative farming, and this is a way for them to actually measure and demonstrate that what they're doing, their activities on the ground, are producing good quality outcomes. We have a number of properties that also export, like beef, for example, overseas, into European markets, into premium markets, and they are demanding this kind of reporting. And lastly, ESG and impact investment, and really kind of underpinning a lot of the discussions around nature positive. So using Accounting for Nature to underpin their ESG reportings year on year, ensuring that they are dealing with any nature risks along the supply chain. Second last slide. So I really like to pitch things and how things come together, and this is something that to me makes a lot of sense around how a lot of these core elements need to interact together to really be able to confidently make claims in the market to the public around outcomes related to nature restoration. So I think about the cornerstone of a stone arch being that key first stone that you put down that every other kind of block is built around. And in my mind, this is where we look at the core elements of an environmental account, using good, robust scientific measurements, measuring the condition of our assets, not just presence, absence, or extent. want to know the health of our actual assets. What level of accuracy? Is it rigorous measurement? Does it use reference benchmarks? Is it a standard common currency that can be easily understood and kind of broken down by somebody that isn't a scientist that understands the nuances of measuring the condition of nature? That's a cornerstone. The keystone is then bringing it all together into actually building an environmental account, having it certified, having it independently verified to say, yes, they implemented this method correctly, what they're reporting is accurate. You bring that all together and then you put a capstone on top, holds everything together, and upon that you can make the claims. But unless you have all those key pieces underneath, you don't have the structure to be able to make and support those claims. So these are the core principles that are really being discussed and highlighted in the development of these environmental markets. It is challenging, ensuring that we use really good quality science-based metrics, that there's agreement about the types of metrics that are used. The accounting is high integrity, that there is transparency, so any claim can be properly investigated by anybody. The inclusion of Indigenous people and local communities. How do we ensure that there's value and that there's benefits that are going to the communities that are so intrinsically related and connected to nature? And in most cases, they ensure the sustainability of these restoration efforts as well. And the evidence of genuine outcomes. Do good on the ground and be able to measure it and to be able to show it. So there's no shortcuts to nature positive. It is a really complex space, particularly when we think about the mitigation hierarchy, particularly when we think about reporting and ensuring proper, good outcomes to the environment. All these things need to come together, and we haven't done a very good job historically about doing that. So it's really going to need a big change in our thinking and our recognition of what needs to be measured and reported to be able to confidently report on the condition of nature and also the improvements that we're saying we're delivering if we're actually going to meet these targets by 2030. And lastly, I just wanted to plug the Nature Positive CRC. So this is something that Australia is doing, and so this is a cooperative research centre, Nature Positive group, which is made up of a lot of partners from academic space, from industry, from markets, from groups like Accounting for Nature around standard setting, all trying to work out, well, what does nature positive mean in Australia? What are the key elements of nature positive? How do we measure nature? How do we report on it? What are the market mechanisms that we need to be able to facilitate this, not just immediately, but for long-term future? And how do we accelerate the transition? How do we leverage what we're already doing in the net zero transition space to then ensure that we have also good quality biodiversity outcomes and not just tokenistic biodiversity outcomes? And that is my lecture.